The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President.
I'm in receipt of a message from the Acting President, which reads as follows. June 20th, 2022. Dear Mr. President, I wish to inform the Honorable the Senate that, with the approval of the Honorable Prime Minister, it is proposed that in accordance with the provisions of Section 33 of the Constitution of Barbados, I will continue to perform the functions of the Office of President from 19th June to 27th June 2022. As the Honorable the Senate will not meet prior to the extension of the acting period, it will not be possible for the usual formal message to be sent to your chamber. Will you, therefore, please bring the extension of acting formally to the attention of the Honorable the Senate when next it meets? Yours faithfully, Acting President.
Honor.
I'm in receipt of the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, June 1st, 2022, for confirmation. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the adoption of the minutes as described.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting of June 1st, 2022 be confirmed. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. The minutes stand confirmed. In terms of further announcements, I have apologies for absence from senators who are there on business, Senator Dr. Crystal Haynes, Senator Malilou, and Senator Nurse. And apologies for lateness, Senator Kevin Boyce. He is in court.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following documents in the Senate today. The Public Finance Management Order 2022, the Securities Christopher Calendar Exemption Order for 2022, and the Securities Yuli Juarez Exemption Order 2022.
Or parliamentary.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to give notice of the following bill, the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Bill 2022.
Motions. Standing order. Motions.
I also wish to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Introduction bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, no, I wish to give notice of the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Bill 2022.
Thank
you. Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Bill 2022. Mr. President, also on June 15th, we gave notice of the Pandemic Contribution Levy Bill. I beg to move the first reading of that bill as well.
The question is that the bills aforementioned be read the first time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Those bills, therefore, are read the first time.
Public business.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 2, sir. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, which business has been assigned to Senator Dr. the Honorable Senator Dr. the Honorable Monroe Knight.
Senator Dr. Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. The matter before us this morning is the bill that would make a provision for the introduction of levy to be known as the Pandemic Contribution Levy 2022. Mr. President, I would want to suggest that there is no Barbadian, regardless of color, class, or constituency, because that is a demarcator in Barbados, that would argue that the COVID-19 pandemic did not present this country with extreme challenges. I also believe, Mr. President, that no right-thinking Barbadian would disagree that the pandemic and its impact was wider than the health sector. I believe, Mr. President, that we are all cognizant that the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact touch across all sectors and everyone in this society. It had socioeconomic impact, educational impact. It impacted employment levels, investment levels, Mr. President. In essence, the COVID-19 and its impact affected the national development project of this country. And in the context of that impact on the national development project, it means, Mr. President, that we have to and are in a process of rebuilding. But not rebuilding to the same state as we were before, but we speak now of building back better. And what does this mean, Mr. President? It means that the intent is to ensure that we have resilient institutions, that our economy is more resilient and sustainable, that we are able to ensure that the lessons that we've learned from the COVID-19 in terms of where our economy is weak, that we need to be able to address those. We are, Mr. President, on a national project to build back better. In the context of this national project to build back better, it means that we require all Barbadians to contribute to this effort, to contribute to this national project. It means, Mr. President, that it requires many actors, and that those actors that come to the table will come with different resources and different levels of capacities. But they do so, and we need them to do so, because there is a cause at hand in this national project. So that while we are all impacted at some level in this pandemic, the rebuilding effort requires that there will be some of us that will be required to hold a little bit more of the strain than others. It is the national effort. The COVID pandemic was unplanned, unforeseen, and therefore presents this country with a specific challenge that we have to be able to respond to. That we have to ensure that the development gains that we have made at this country are not destroyed. I want to remind this honorable chamber that even in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, this country was also faced with a freak storm, ashfall, Hurricane Elsa. And Mr. President, there are those that might say, well, we talk about this all the time. But it's important that we keep this front of mind in Barbadians, because it helps us to understand what we have faced, what we continue to face, and most importantly, also what is at stake, Mr. President. Barbados Human Development Index for 2019, as indicated in the 2020 report, puts Barbados at 0.814, which is amongst the very high human development category, on which we sit with only one other Caribbean country, Bahamas, positioning this country at 58 out of 189 countries and territories. The HDI effectively, Mr. President, measures life expectancy, schooling, and a country's gross national income. Mr. President, essentially, when we look at the Human Development Index, we're talking about health, schooling, and economic growth. The World Bank indicates that COVID-19 has seen the biggest crisis in education worldwide. The OECD report in 2020, looking at the prospects of economies to rebound from the pandemic, predicted that for Latin America and the Caribbean, that many of them will, for a long period of time, experience negative growth. That OECD report also suggested that for Latin America and the Caribbean, that there was a threat that we could go back to 2009 levels of economic growth. Mr. President, what is at stake for this country? And if we ask ourselves what is at stake for this country, then we must also ask, can we afford not to have those that can contribute more to be able to do so, Mr. President? What is at stake? In this special effort and in this particular circumstance, we must address a specific principle that should be applied. And the principle, Mr. President, that I want to suggest that is perhaps in this context not applicable is that of equality, where we are all treated the same, or that we all have to contribute the same. But rather, the principle is a specific type of equity which recognizes that there is some differentiation to be made amongst unequals. Mr. President, let me explain. If someone was to come in this honorable chamber and put on the desk of every one of us a free bottle of water of the same type and the same number, we would all say that we have been treated equally, and that is fair. Yeah? Everybody got the same thing, same water, and that is fair. But, Mr. President, sometimes when we look to the principle of equality, we forget that there are structural inequalities that we need to be mindful of. So that process of inequality, of the attempt at ensuring that we have equality, perhaps did not recognize, Mr. President, that I have walked with my own bottle of water, which I am able to buy and bring along. It did not recognize that the leader of government business has a budget for a particular brand of water that she has to bring in from overseas because she has the capacity in order to be able to do so. I'm not talking the business of the leader of government business. Look at business coming out. But it also doesn't recognize that the colleague on my right is perhaps twice as thirsty as we are, and therefore perhaps requires a greater share of the water. So that me not having water doesn't take anything from me, doesn't disadvantage me because I have some level of capacity. It doesn't take anything away from the leader of government business because she also has a level of capacity. So that we apply the principle of equity and we can still get to the same situation of equality because our thirsts are satisfied even though we have been treated differently, Mr. President. So that within this context, we have a situation in which the effort is not necessarily about treating everybody equally, but making sure that we recognize that those with a different level of capacity can contribute to this national effort that we have. Mr. President, what am I saying? Clause 3 of the bill before us indicates that the pandemic contribution levy is imposed for the purpose of helping the country to cope with the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is therefore a financing mechanism that is targeted to help this country recover sustainably and responsibly to the unplanned impact of the pandemic. Mr. President, the burden for this COVID-19 and its impact must be shared. But I suggest again, it cannot be shared equally. And Mr. President, as I have spoken to the notion of burden sharing, let's look a bit at what that burden actually looks like. And in order to do so, Mr. President, I have to remind this chamber and Barbadians that when this government came into office, it was facing a debt to GDP ratio of 176%. This is where we started in 2018, Mr. President. This is where we started. And just in a matter of a couple of years, even less than 2 years, we were then faced with the impact of COVID-19. Mr. President, I make that point because we have to understand the national effort and cause that we need to be able to contribute to. Mr. President, as we've learned in the other place during the budget debate, COVID-19 cost this government over $1 billion. $1 billion. 390 million increase in welfare and health costs, and $600 million of lost revenue as tourism declined, investment contracted, and businesses closed across this country. So a government that was faced coming into office with efforts to try to stabilize this economy and apply fiscal prudence, was also then faced with another national effort that required a level of resources. Mr. President, I also want to recall that the national insurance scheme in Barbados was placed under tremendous pressure to the fact that the unemployment fund was depleted. In fact, the NIS reports in 2020, Mr. President, that it had to give claims in the amount of $155.5 million. $155.5 million, while in 2019, it was given $49.3 million, and in 2018, some $38.1 million. Moreover, Mr. President, the NIS reported that funds in the amount of $18.3 million were processed and paid to employees whose employers had not paid the requisite contributions. The national effort, Mr. President. Mr. President, did the government throw down arms and say we cannot cope? Did the government go silent and withdraw from the population and say fend for yourself? No such thing, Mr. President, because this government is a responsible government. The government was forced to respond to the situation that the country was facing, Mr. President. It meant that we had to find the money immediately to address the situation that was multifaceted. And while other countries bigger than ours descended almost into chaos, and we saw the images, Mr. President, mass graves, people having to sleep and ask for care on hospital floors. We saw all of that, but we did not see it here in Barbados, Mr. President. It was responsible governance. It was a government who understood that it needed to be able to respond to the needs of its population, and furthermore understood the national project that was had. Mr. President, I hope that we can recall that this government also introduced the business interruption benefit to help self-employed persons who during the lockdowns, of course, could not operate and therefore would not have any income coming in. Mr. President, over 1,481 self-employed persons were able to benefit from this fund, valued at $3,000, in an effort, again, to mitigate the impact. So that there are those that would suggest that the government is not doing enough, Mr. President, that we need to do more. But I suggest that the record would indicate that the government, again, is a responsible and clear and caring government. And that was not all, Mr. President. The government also introduced the NAS deferral for employers who were retaining more than 3/4 or 2/3 of their employees for 3 months in the first instance, and then if they needed to, that they could have an extension for another 3 months. Laid off workers, Mr. President, received benefits for 6 months, and those that were on short weeks received 60% of the days that they were not working. The government put its hand to the task of the national effort, Mr. President. Mr. President, further, the government sought to directly assist the most vulnerable within our societies, because in the context of scarce resources, the government had to ensure, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and remember, Mr. President, we're talking here about Clause 3 and the reason for this pandemic levy, that those that were most vulnerable and at risk in our society could be taken care of. The government of Barbados introduced the Barbados Vulnerable Family Survival Program, injecting at the onset $10 million into that program. And as part of that, under the Household Mitigation Program, targeted 1,500 families to receive a grant of $600 monthly so that they would be able to support themselves and their families. Under that Household Mitigation Program unit, we saw persons, families with more than 4, and particularly families of children under the age of 21, persons who would have lost their jobs due to public sector layoffs, people that were identified in a non-partisan way in communities who were adjudged to be the most vulnerable, benefiting from a caring government. The government put its hand to this national effort. The government directly engaged, Mr. President, workers to shore up employment in several areas. Community elderly care, if you remember that program, school COVID monitors, ash cleanup workers, community health liaison officers. The government did not stop working, Mr. President. it did not stop its efforts to ensure that the most vulnerable in our society were taken care of. So again, Mr. President, I think that those who would want to suggest to this population that government has not and is not doing enough for the most vulnerable, perhaps deliberately do not want to see the government record of its efforts to ensure that the most vulnerable are empowered, even in the context of constrained resources, Mr. President. I want to reiterate that as far as I am aware, the government does not have a gold mine. I am not aware that the government has a pot somewhere from which then it can, whenever that there is a crisis, put its hand in that pot, Mr. President, and pull out the resources and say, voila. I'm not aware, Mr. President, there's some fairy that's walking about and saying, here, whoosh, whoosh, this is what you need. I'm not aware, Mr. President, that there is a benevolent benefactor that is out there saying, here, government, and perhaps even if there was, we would not want to engage because that's another kettle of fish. But what I'm saying, Mr. President, is that the government had to strategically be able to look for the necessary finances to address these concerns that, again, were on plan and not of its making. And even now, Mr. President, as we encounter this particular stage of the world economy, fuel crisis, supply crisis, food crisis, not of the government's making, but the government is strategically attempting to balance so that it ensures that it can not only maintain but expand social service delivery, help the most underprivileged within our society, but also as well do so in a fiscally responsible way, Mr. President. And I think, Mr. President, that I cannot underscore that point enough. The government has moved to borrow through various instruments, and sometimes, Mr. President, spend money when we didn't know in some instances where we would get the financing from. But I want to ask Barbadians, look at where we are now. We complain and we are complaining about the level of debt and borrowing. But the government has not borrowed willy-nilly. The government has not borrowed, Mr. President, to put money into projects that will not lead to investment and outcomes for this country. I have indicated in my presentation thus far that the government's borrowing has shored up the social services and provided protection for the most vulnerable in this society. Government investment, government borrowing has fueled investment in capital projects, Mr. President, in order that this country can rebound. Clause 4 of the bill before us, Mr. President, indicates that the pandemic contribution levy applies essentially to companies or firms operating in Barbados, specifically, Mr. President, in the areas of telecommunications, life and general insurance, commercial banking, excluding credit unions, and companies engaged in the retail sale of fuel that have a net income of $5 million, a net income of $5 million or more for the financial years of either 2020, 2021, or both. Essentially, Mr. President, the levy is applied on corporate profits of companies. Mr. President, I want to say that, yes, those companies, like all of Barbados, went through the pandemic. Mr. President, those companies would have had to make some adjustments. Those companies too would have felt the impact of the pandemic on their businesses. But what the record also shows, Mr. President, is that those companies were able to rebound. They were able to rebound, Mr. President, in a way that saw them, in many instances, increasing their net profits from 2019 levels, while corporate taxes fell by 33%. Mr. President, the principle of equity. It means, Mr. President, that those companies can afford, perhaps, to give up their bottles of water to benefit others in this society who need assistance. It means, Mr. President, that we are asking these companies that we have not selected willy-nilly. We didn't do 1, 2, 3 and pull out from the hat. But the government undertook a strategic analysis, that showed us that for these sectors and for these companies, that they could help share the burden of this cost of the pandemic. And through this levy, Mr. President, the intent is that the government will be able to raise $100 million, or 10% of government COVID cost. The levy will become due as of July 2022 and payable to the Barbados Revenue Authority in 8 installments, and will only be in place up to March 31st, 2023. It's a one-off levy, Mr. President. It's a one-off levy. And we're asking these companies to contribute 15% of their net income to the national effort. Mr. President, I am not going to stand here and say to you that this levy will not perhaps cause some level of displacement for companies. But I will stand here and say to you that we are all in an uncomfortable position. I will stand here and say to you, Mr. President, that we are all called on in this moment to share this burden. I will stand here before you, Mr. President, and say that in the context of the fact that you have some ability to be able to achieve those profits in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, that there's some ability for you to be able to continue to contribute. And therefore, Mr. President, this pandemic levy, as it is applied to the companies identified, is intended to help the government close responsibly its financing gap. You know, one of the contradictions, Mr. President, that is interesting in the context of this debate is that on the one hand, we are criticized for borrowing too much. At the same time, how do we balance the need or our responsibility as a government to continue to be able to responsibly address the needs of our society, continue to provide education, continue to provide health care, without having some facility in order to be able to raise resources domestically? There's a balance, Mr. President, that needs to be had. And the government, through this pandemic contribution levy, is seeking to make sure that we have that balance in terms of how we address this gap, how we address this project, how we address this challenge, Mr. President, that we are facing. Clause 4 also indicates that the pandemic contribution levy is applied to income. It indicates that it's applied to the employed, those who have an income, a monthly income of $6,250 or more for the period April 1st, 2022 to March 31st, 2023. And similarly, to the self-employed, those who have an income of $75,000 or more for the same period, April 1st, 2022 to 31st of March, 2023. And these two categories will contribute 1% of their monthly income to this national effort. Mr. President, if my math is correct, so if I look at that figure, 6,250, and the mathematicians in here, please correct me, because it's not one of my strong points. But my basic arithmetic suggests to me that monthly, that is approximately $62.50. Yeah, $62.50. Now, Mr. President, I don't want to at all or in any way belittle how much that $62.50, and we can go down as we extrapolate, will mean for people's budgets. But I also want to indicate, Mr. President, that certainly, being the good mother and wife that I am, I took my husband out to Father's Day lunch, along with my one child. Mr. President, the bill for lunch, for that one moment, one man, one woman, and one child, Mr. President, was equal to almost a week of my mortgage payment in that one single moment of food. In that one single moment of food, Mr. President. That ain't fancy, that ain't fancy at all. That ain't fancy at all, yeah? But what I am demonstrating is that it requires from us a level of sacrifice, Mr. President. So of course I had to say to the family, no, we ain't gonna do that again. Of course I have to be able to say to the family in the context of rising food costs that we have to be able to cut back. So if we got 2 cars, we can try to make sure that we line up what everybody got to do so that we could take 1 car, make 1 journey, and save on the gas. It's a sacrifice, Mr. President, that we are called on to make in this moment. And I know that there are those amongst us that would say, Mr. President, that the burden of this falls on the middle class. That the government is essentially trying to unravel the middle class with this measure. And that the middle class has continually had to bear the burden, of lifting this country up whenever we face a challenge. Mr. President, I stand with my hands in the air and I say, it's true. We've had to do that. The middle class has had to do that. But that is the middle class globally, Mr. President. Mr. President, I say that this is a situation, unfortunately, that we find ourselves in. And I reiterate that it requires a level of sacrifice that Barbadians, middle-class Barbadians, because of the standard of living that we have, free education, free health care. Mr. President, I've traveled all over, and people marvel at what Barbados is able to deliver to its population, because we have been able to maintain a standard of living. And it comes, Mr. President, at a particular sacrifice. And we're therefore asking the middle class in the context of this moment that we are in to shoulder some burden, 1% for 12 months, Mr. President. 1% for 12 months to help this country confront the challenge and ensure that we can find ourselves on a path to recovery that is sustainable and fiscally responsible. Mr. President, I want to say again that those of us who find ourselves amongst that category of middle class who can contribute, that we have to see ourselves as being our brother's keeper, that we have to see ourselves in the context of this situation where we have poverty in this country at 19%, that we have to see ourselves as being on the front line for those who at this time can do no better. Mr. President, we have to see ourselves in a moment facing a cause that we have to pick up arms and help this country fight. And again, I say to you, Mr. President, of course it is going to be uncomfortable. No one likes to pay more taxes. No one likes to see money coming out of their pockets. But again, I want to ask, are we here, Mr. President, because of fiscal mismanagement of this government? Are we here, Mr. President, because of some malfeasance? No. We are here with a government who has proven itself capable to the extent that the way that this government has managed its finances, has managed the economy, has managed the society through the COVID pandemic, has been held up as a model internationally. Mr. President. So that even though it is uncomfortable, even though the shoe is pinching a bit, Mr. President, we are confident that if Barbadians, the companies, and the individuals to which this pandemic contribution levy applies, stay the course with us, that we will be able to move this country, as I said before, forward in terms of addressing this challenge. Mr. President, we note that the IMF staff mission indicated some concerns relative to the imposition of the levy and its impact on the investment climate. And the IMF concerns are noted, and we respect the views of the IMF. We believe that the application of the levy in the current climate offers a fiscally responsible vehicle to raise the necessary financing. At the same time that we note the IMF's concern in respect of that, we also note that the IMF has indicated that our homegrown birth program has been successful. So while they critique, and they are fair to do so, they've also said what you are doing makes good sense and you are making progress in the context of all of the measures of the birth program, Mr. President. Such that they have indicated in their last report that Barbados then will be able to have its available drawdown. Mr. President, I also want to, very briefly, again, address this matter because I know that as soon as I say the words IMF, there's going to be some level of outcry and angst within the country, as there is now. Concern over the level of government borrowing, concern over the extent to which we are getting money from different sources. Mr. President, a country has to be able to manage its budget, just like we all have to in the context of our various households. We make strategic choices in terms of, at the individual level, the debt that we would incur. Mr. President, I'm going to use myself as an example. Like the traditional Barbadian, every Christmas, and listen, my husband, I can talk in business now, is very famous for it. Everything in the house is working perfectly until Christmas. My husband always finds something that needs replacing or upgrading in the house. There is a strategic decision that has to be made about whether or not, at the individual level, we will take up available resources that we have in hand to purchase that item, or whether or not we would enter into a credit arrangement with a lender, Mr. President. And we say to ourselves that if we take up the available resources that we have in hand, it will mean that some of the other things that we need to take care of, we might not be able to have provision for. So if I buy the new fridge at $5,000 or $6,000, because we may have available cash so we can take up the salary and we can buy this big fridge, it means then that I have to ask myself, how am I going to pay for all of the other things? Government is the same way, Mr. President. Government is the same way. We have to make strategic decisions about how we will spend the resources that are available to us. And one of those strategic decisions has to be about how we will manage our debt responsibly. And the government, in the context of working with the IMF, is doing so, one, under a homegrown, and I say it again, BERT program. That is our program, Mr. President. We are not implementing the IMF's program. The IMF ain't having no control. This is our BERT program, Mr. President. This is our BERT program. And the money that we are getting from the IMF, we're doing so at concessional rates, Mr. President. Concessional rates, Mr. President. So that again, at the individual level, when I am making a decision about whether or not I will enter into a hire purchase agreement with some creditor, I decide who got the best interest rates. I can shop around. I go into, well, I can't remember, the courts and Massey and Standard, and I can look and see who will give me the best terms. And I make the decision on the basis of who will give me the best terms and the extent that I can repay based on the income I know that I will have coming in. And so that the government, in the context of its engagement with the IMF, is making a strategic decision about how it will manage its debt by ensuring that the financing that it receives is concessional and that it will have ongoing income in order to be able to pay back that debt. I want to indicate as well, Mr. President, that the government is taking a holistic frame to this issue. There are some that would say what we need to do is to give money through direct cash transfers, programs to the poor and the powerless. And that is the most effective means by which to address the issue. Mr. President, I want to suggest that we have learned some lessons. And those lessons have said to us that we have to have a more robust and a whole-of-country approach if we want to address the fiscal challenges facing this country, and as well help to address the socio-economic challenges facing. So the government, in the context of its engagement with the IMF, in the context of asking people to bear the burden through the pandemic contribution levy, is also as well seeking to stimulate growth within the economy. The government has embarked, Mr. President, on a program to expand opportunities for exports into new markets for this country. Some of us would have seen that the government just opened a new mission in Nairobi, Kenya. And people, again, were asking, why are we spending money there? Why are we talking about all this engagement with Africa? And I want to suggest that even outside of the historical and cultural ties, that strategically, this engagement is about opening export markets. In April of 2022 of this year, we had the first shipment of exports to Ghana, some $20,000 worth of exports, as a first foothold into that market and open it up, Mr. President. I want this chamber to also remember that the government is intended to embark on a wide capital works program, intended as well to revitalize Bridgetown. I want, Mr. President, to recall that the government is placing emphasis on agricultural sector production. This is not, Mr. President, haphazard. This is not haphazard policy making that has happened here. What we are doing is creating a sustainable framework and ecosystem, Mr. President, because we recognize that in order to address these systemic challenges, we need a multifaceted approach which helps to stimulate economic growth so that even those companies and individuals in the middle class who are going to be impacted can have greater opportunities, again, within the context of an economy that is working and growing, Mr. President. And so that the government's project and vision for this national development project that we have, that we are asking everyone to put their hands to, is, as I said before, multifaceted and multi-pronged. I also want to say, Mr. President, that we ought to be very careful about looking for very immediate short-term gains. The lessons that we have learned when we talk about building resilience is that resilience building requires a very strategic and concerted approach. That means sometimes that change takes place over the longer term. And therefore, even as the government seeks to strengthen its delivery of social services through a complete revamp of the social services sector, so that we can strengthen the robustness of our response and delivery. Again, Mr. President, I hope that I am painting that picture for you, is that we cannot see the imposition of this pandemic contribution levy through just one lens, but that we all ought to understand one context that we have. We are facing an unfriendly economic environment. Mr. President, there's nobody out there who is just waiting to just give us free money and finances. But the government has to be able to exercise the necessary fiscal prudence in order to be able to raise the finances that are necessary, that we can maintain, Mr. President, that Human Development Index that I talked about before, that we can ensure that we keep our eyes on what is at stake. Mr. President, as I close, I want to recognize again that this period that we are all in is uncomfortable for all of us. The cost of living continues to rise. There are supply side constraints, and every day there is a new challenge on the horizon. But amidst this uncertainty, Mr. President, the glue that will hold this country together lies in the willingness of all of us that are able to sacrifice and be our brothers and sisters' keeper. It is interesting, Mr. President, that the way forward lies in just this simple value of being your brother's keeper. This pandemic contribution levy, Mr. President, yes, it ring-fences companies, yes, it ring-fences the middle class. But as we hold strain together and tighten our belts, I want to suggest, Mr. President, that in that moment, as we do this, we might very well arrive at the best version of the Barbadian spirit that is exemplified by our resilience and willingness to sacrifice. I'm obliged to you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I do now beg that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Dr. Moroni. Senator Dr. Hines.
Good morning, Mr. President and all. I would like to start by saying that I agree that we all should contribute to paying for the very expensive COVID-19 pandemic and all that it has brought to this country and really to the world. I also believe in equity and that this is an important principle. But I also believe in fairness. And there is an element of this levy that I do not believe is fair. And because of this unfairness that is included in this levy, I do not support it. Now, there is a part that I support. I fully support those who are employed and who earn at the level of $6,250 and above, as well as employers reaching the threshold laid out in the bill, paying from this year going forward, albeit that this begins in April 2022 and April is gone. So we are bringing into law something that I assume has already begun. And the expectation is that on the 15th of the month after individuals earn at this level, that this should be collected by employers. So this has already begun. We are in the process, I suppose, of making legal something that has already started. And one of the things that I think that people should have is the ability to, if they desire, look at legislation that affects them before it begins to affect them and not after. So this is a somewhat, and let me be fair, it is not as if this has been snuck in and no one knew about it. We were informed. However, to have the clarity of the written legislation beforehand would have been quite helpful to those who are affected by it. Be that as it may, I want to focus on the main part that I disagree with, and I disagree for slightly different reasons than the IMF, and this is this issue of retroactive taxation. So yes, it is true, no one can deny, or let me not say so, some people can deny, but it is quite unlikely that people would take issue with the types of companies being identified, that have been identified to pay at the level of 15%. Those with net incomes of 5 million or above, and in the specific sectors. This is relatively fair to me. What is unfair is that you're going back in time to do this, 2020 and 2021. I do not believe that this is fair. And it is not that I am saying that these companies are, poor entities that now are going to have to look to scramble to find the resources. I don't think it is fair to go in the past when people have reasonable expectations as to what is to happen, and we do not know how they have planned their affairs because we are going 2 years back in the past, 2020 and 2021. So I am not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be one. I don't really want to be one either. And I just put that out here. But I have been reading some of what the legal scholars have had to say on this matter of retroactive taxation. And there's quite a bit written on it. And most of what I could find has not been in favor of retroactive taxation. I found Lon Fuller, a legal scholar. He wrote The Morality of Law in 1977, and he actually called retroactive legislation a monstrosity. And this individual goes on to note that persons should have legitimate expectations, and that is what the law should provide, legitimate expectations. They should know the law in advance. There are several others since then who have written on the topic, not necessarily on the morality of law, but on retroactive taxation. I noted a few of them, some in favor, some that present both sides. For instance, Saul Levmore, A Case for Retroactive Taxation, lays out why he believes that retroactive taxation is sensible. And he notes that it is sensible because it allows for efficiency, because entities are not able to avoid taxation. So when you know in advance, especially powerful entities, wealthy persons, what the tax regime is looking like, you can do some tax planning to try and avoid, as far as possible, taxation. Whilst when we do this in the past, retroactively, most persons who would not anticipate this taxation, they basically get their pockets picked in. Their money is there, it has already been earned, and there's no way you can avoid it because we have already highlighted that you've earned at a particular amount, and we're going to go back in time, not the Fed, but we're going to go 2 years back, in this case, to take this money for a very good cause. No one is saying that the cause is a bad one. So let me just say some of what I've written here. Retroactive taxation decreases efforts to alter behaviors of those who can be taxed so that they can avoid taxes. If it is a one-time tax, it can be efficient because it's based on what is known, that's in the past, versus what is unsure. Even if a company made $5 million last year, there's no guarantee that it will make $5 million this year. So you're taxing on something that is certain, what has already occurred. So this is efficient. Most will be caught by surprise, and as I said, cannot make these adjustments to their behavior. And there can be welfare gains if this is a one-off. And I believe that is what this is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a one-off. And the benefits, in terms of the financial benefits, outweigh the costs. So that these funds will be used in the way that has been set out by whatever legislation. However, governments must still convince investors that this is a one-off, because people do not want to think that they're going to come and invest someplace, make some money, and then the government can go back in time whenever there is an emergency, a hurricane that could come every year, we know, climate change, a freak storm or something. So investors may get a little bit skittish if they believe that they're moving into a place or operating in a place that will go back in time and tax their earnings whenever there is a crisis or an emergency. And this is a significant risk of this. And it is one of the risks that IMF has pointed out, although for a slightly different reason. Now, if we look at the cons, and I have found some of these in Retroactive Taxation by Ronald Domsky. Some of the risks, the drawbacks, and as I mentioned, basic fairness. This is changing the rules of the game after you finish playing the game. So you go and you play football, and you know that there are certain rules in place. You score a goal, you score 5 goals. And then the day after the game, after the match, someone comes back and says, oh, we are not allowing persons who are shorter than 5'5" to score goals. Because they have an advantage because of the distribution of the weight and the center of gravity and that kind of thing. So the 2 people that scored those goals are going to be taken away. And now the result is different. So this is just a simplistic kind of analogy. But this is one of the things that they point out in the literature. They use this example of the game, and that even children know it is not fair to change the rules of the game after you finish playing the game. So even though this team that won 5-0 still wins 3-0, it is not fair. It is not fair. And we have to consider fairness in what we do as legislators. It introduces a level of uncertainty versus predictability. And it also opens us up to this feeling of arbitrariness. So we know that the cause here is a good cause. But as I mentioned previously, there may be many causes that can be framed as good and worthy so that the government has the ability to arbitrarily go back in time and garner some of what persons, corporations, whatever entities have earned. And this can lead to abuse. And I am not saying that this power is being abused now, but doing it sets up a precedent, if you will. And I'm not using this in the legal sense because, as I said, I'm not a lawyer. But it makes it seem as if this is a place where we can and we will use arbitrary measures as needed when there is a problem. And I do not think that this is right. So while I do think that there should be different levels at which entities pay based on their earnings, based on their ability to pay, I think that this should begin in the present and go forward. It can begin in the present and go forward for a limited time period still, sure, in order to obtain the same objective. The objective is what? $100 million? We can achieve that $100 million without going into the past and doing something that is not fair. And it's not because I, as I said previously, feel for these entities that have been doing quite well and that have done well in the pandemic. That they have done well in the pandemic, I don't even believe is something that we should be punishing them for. Because we are operating in an environment where businesses are encouraged to make money. This is a capitalist place that we are living in, even though we have, certain welfare provisions and so on. Entrepreneurs are supposed to make money, businesses are supposed to make money. They're not supposed to be punished for doing so. And I understand this is not a punishment per se, but it certainly feels that way when you go back in time and do it. So my proposition here is that this would be much better if it started in 2022 and went forward rather than went into the past. It is not fair. I don't think it is, as I said, I'm not a lawyer, but according to some of the things that I've read from certain legal scholars, and I try to read a lot, as I said, I'm not an expert, many of them do not think that this is a fair approach, although it is an efficient one. And I think we do have to consider fairness in our dealings. And on this basis, Mr. President, I do not support this bill. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Andrew Boyce.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. President. I stand in support of the pandemic contribution levy out of an appreciation, as indicated by Senator Monroe Knight, that the bill seeks to ensure the appropriate financing of Barbados' recovery program. And to get a little more granular, Mr. President, the levy seeks to ensure the financing of the country's social program. And thus, it forms part of a long, storied and fairly successful history of ensuring that this country takes care of individuals who cannot efficiently or sufficiently care for themselves. And so it is on that basis that I think there is no legitimate reason for me not to support the bill. One now deceased former regional leader, Mr. President, is often quoted as having said that it takes cash to care. But perhaps more to the point, it takes a collective approach to us putting our hands to the plow to ensure that we can continue to service and improve, particularly Barbados's social initiatives at a time when Barbadians need them most. Make no mistake, Mr. President, I and this administration recognize the challenges associated with the current socio-economic moment, rather. Right, a moment, Mr. President, defined by rising food and commodity prices, and some projection of harsher times down the road. But even in that context, Mr. President, we ought not to be confused or blinded by the sacrifice we're being asked to make. Because as Senator Monroe Knight indicated, the stability of the national project depends on all of our contributions, irrespective of the difficulty of this moment. It also must be noted, Mr. President, that the administration has been judicious in the use of that which it has been given so far and has achieved much in the context of challenging times. In the midst of a BERT program, I think we often forget that the government provided assistance through a household mitigation program, an Adopt a Families program, the provision of care packages, all while the Welfare Department, the National Assistance Board, the National Disabilities Unit, the Child Care Board provided services and assistance for which those institutions are well known. And so, the track record of this government, even in the context of these difficult times, is clear, is certain, and it is in that context that this government has the credibility to ask ordinary Barbadians to contribute to the collective effort. And so, Mr. President, it amazes me, it is in that context that I am often amazed that when I hear comments about the administration shirking its responsibility of governance and that it needs to stop whining and get on with governing. Mr. President, if laying bare the realities of governance when governance is at its most challenging, if taking Barbadians into our confidence, if saying to them, these are the realities and these are the limited resources, if mechanizing greater degrees of democracy through conversation, if putting them at the center of the national project offends anyone, and particularly if Mr. President offends anyone who aspired to be a member of these houses, I am almost inclined to say that the innate wisdom of the Barbadian elector has served us well. Mr. President, the speaker before me, the Honorable Dr. Hines, in her presentation, made reference to retroactive taxation. She made reference to arbitrariness and punishment. And I want to say to the Barbadians who have been asked to sacrifice and to contribute to the national project that this is not punishment, that this is not arbitrary. And that when we define arbitrariness, certainly in a legal context, the Honorable Senator Nichols can bear this out. We talk about a lack of certainty. We talk about a lack of criterion. And the bill before us makes it very clear the individuals who are to pay, the basis on which they are to pay. And Mr. President, we have heard in this morning's contributions, certainly from Senator Monroe Knight, the collective effort to which all of them are being asked to contribute. Mr. President, but I want to spend some time and drill down on the provision of social services, because we cannot have this conversation in the abstract. It is something of a regret. It is regrettable that in this country, this administration and previous administrations have grappled with and only had, some may say, marginal success with wrestling the issues of the poor to the ground. And it is in that context that the minister with substantive responsibility for the government's social policy has conceived of an amalgamation of the social services entities to create a family services department aimed at ensuring greater care and efficiency in the response to Barbadians who need it most. And Mr. President, when I hear the minister speak about reforms that will prevent individuals from standing in lines to receive disbursements, when I hear him speak of the innovative systems that will prevent abuses of the system, when I hear him, Mr. President, speak about bringing the country into the modern day with a suite of legislation to protect children, to protect the elderly, and to protect persons with disabilities, I say, the investment is worth it. Sir, in addition to the amalgamation of the social services and the creation of the family services department, the government has crafted a 1,000+ families program aimed at ensuring that vulnerable Barbadians and their families benefit from the provision of social services. Mr. President, but this is no ordinary provision of social services. They are planks to the provision of services that include housing, that include education, that include basic identity and parenting and parenting classes. That is to say, Mr. President, that this administration has taken a structural approach to the issues that bedevil the less fortunate that may bedevil the less fortunate in this country. That this goes beyond the provision of income, it goes beyond the provision of financial assistance, Mr. President. It says that we are making a way to improve the structural realities for Barbadians who are less fortunate. I want to also commend the minister for taking a bipartisan approach, if you will. He indicated that in the recent past, he has met with ministers with responsibility for the provision of social services across administrations and has listened to them and taken on board their recommendations. Mr. President, the weight of this challenge requires all of us. And I think that approach taken by the minister and by the government is in recognition that we do not do this alone. We must do this in concert and with the contribution of Barbadians of goodwill. And so the weight of the challenge makes it so that we do not have the luxury on this side of putting together a hodgepodge set of policies that there must be crafting and contemplation if we intend for them to benefit the average Barbadian. Because there is work to be done and there are lives to be improved, Mr. President. That is what this administration is attempting to do as it seeks to finance its program, Building Back Better, and better servicing Barbadians and communities who need the assistance most. Mr. President, even as I give commendation to the government for its social program, I must implore the administration that as we ask Barbadians to give a little in the interest of the greater good, that we have a responsibility I am sure we will make good on, to ensure that social protection programs are, that they center human rights and that they center personal autonomy. And when I hear the minister speak, I, for the first time in this country's in the history of this country's social development program, we are hearing clear indicators that human rights, that the autonomy of the person, that personal dignity are fundamental pillars of that which we seek to create. And so I want to congratulate them for that. At a practical level, and in specific relation to persons with disabilities, I would wish that the provision of social services similarly considers the autonomy and the capacity of persons with disabilities and their dignity, and that in the context of attempting to animate the internal policies of the social program, that we are guided by the principles of human rights. As I close, Mr. President, through you, I would wish to say thank you to the Barbadians that contributed to the social spending and program. Some 771 individuals who are the personification of the collective effort. Mr. President, if you would allow me, I wish to borrow the words of the late Prime Minister, the Honorable Owen Arthur, words he delivered of himself in this place at the end of his first budget speech. He said, we cannot resign from the challenge. We are mandated to face it. Our proud tradition of industry and thrift says that we can do it. Our future demands that we do it. Our people expect us to do it. And we will do it because it is our will to aspire, and so to achieve. Mr. President, I am obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Andrea Boyce. Senator Mr. Miller. Okay, defer. Senator Crystal Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I've listened to the debate so far, and many things have been proposed. And there are a few things I want to also add to this Honourable Chamber's debate about this Pandemic Contribution Levy Bill 2022. Sir, when this bill was first introduced in the budgetary speech of March this year, we were right on the heels of the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia commencing. And we understood that there were going to be inflationary pressures, but we were still uncertain of the level and the range by which those levels of inflations were going to reach. Sir, at the time, Barbadians were paying $4.13 per litre. Now Barbadians are paying $4.41, and I'm sure that that price will increase. Food prices, Mr. President, for some have increased to the point where we have persons who are choosing what to pick up and what to put back in their baskets. So, in essence, Mr. President, as much as we've gone through the pandemic, we've borrowed money to do so, to sustain and keep the country afloat. There is now an elephant in the room in relation to the cost of living that will supersede all other ills in society. And sir, at the time when we were discussing what is formerly known as the appropriations bill, but is known as the estimates, I suggested at the time, and I still stand by this position, that the government, rather than directly taking from people's income the cash flow by which they have to survive on, they target this levy on assets, things like long-term fixed deposits, etc. Because if you are able to still sustain that type of investment or asset in an environment such as this, that means you are more likely to be able to share the burden, Mr. President. But, Mr. President, as outlined in the bill, it says that income includes emoluments, income from a business, office, employment, rents, dividends, supplement wages, interest, and directors' remuneration or fees, but does not include pensions, and I will commend the government for that, benefits in any kind, or interest on any government or Barbados bonds, or foreign source of dividends. So clearly, Mr. President, there's a level of asset class that the government has sought to exclude from this levy. And I don't understand the rationale why that was done, and if we could have some explanation as to why certain forms of assets or interest from assets were excluded, but we're asking the middle class, as although it may be $62.50, Mr. President, some of those interest payments from foreign dividends could be in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. But sir, even if you want to target as an administration, which the government has done, the threshold of $6,250, yes, Mr. President, it hits at the heart of the middle class. And by all means, Mr. President, those are the ones, yes, that we know are holding strain. I believe, Mr. President, that there are many people, and we're underestimating, I don't have the data, but this is just from observation, I believe, sir, that many persons in this country who are deemed to be middle class are cash poor and debt-ridden. They're living, sir, off of personal loans, credit cards. They still have their mortgages to pay. They still have their car notes to pay. Many of them, if they miss one or two of their paychecks, will be in financial ruin, and they will fall through the cracks. So, my suggestion to the government, even if you want to place a levy on persons' income in terms of their cash flow, the honorable member who led the debate for this bill, noted there was a strategic analysis that was done. But I was waiting to hear how the government arrived at a threshold of $6,250. Sir, would it have been more appropriate to target persons who make or earn $10,000 per month, $120,000 per year? That is a significantly different income bracket than a person making $6,250. And sir, this is based on the premise that Barbados, like most other societies, the top earners own a large share of the income of a country. Sir, there's a research paper titled "A Community Divided: Top Incomes in CARICOM Member States." As of 2015, Mr. President, the average household income of the richest 10% in Barbados was 3 times that of the general population. When we look at it from the top 1% earners, it is even more glaring in terms of the disparity. The average household income of Barbados' richest 1% had 10 times the income of that of an average household. The richest 1%, Mr. President, had 10 times the income of the average household. And that is why I asked, how did the government arrive at the threshold of $6,250? Because if you look at the earners in that area, they are median income earners, Mr. President. And what is strange is that the government is targeting the top earners in the business community, but not the top earners individually in terms of income earners. And Mr. President, what I'm trying to rationalize is government trying to earn revenues from top earners, but yet at the same time trying to cast such a wide net that they're roping in individuals in the middle class that may not necessarily need to be there. Because if you place a levy on the top earners at a higher rate, if you're looking for $100 million, and I'll ask a question about that later on, can you not have an arrangement by which the levy only focuses on the top 10% earners, the top 5% earners, the top 1% earners, and leave the middle class? That could be a policy decision. That could be a policy position. So, sir, although we're saying there needs to be equity in the system, in an environment where goods and services are increasingly escaping the reach of the average individual, we have to really look at how we design policy. And as I said, I understand the levy, the pandemic contribution levy in principle, but I think, Mr. President, design still has some flaws. Sir, I want to go directly into the bill. Part 2 in particular, because I have some concerns as it relates to certain areas of the bill. Sir, Part 2 deals with the application of levies to employed and self-employed individuals. Sir, the imposition of the levy on employed individuals and self-employed individuals, particularly at Clause 6, states, with effect from the 1st of April 2022, a levy is payable, Part A states, an individual employed in Barbados who has an income of $6,250 or more per month for the period 1st of April 2022 to the 31st of March 2023. But sir, Part B is where it gets very interesting to me. Part B says, an individual employed in Barbados who does not ordinarily have an income of $6,250 or more per month, or $75,000 or more per month, but in any month has income of $6,250 or more for the period the 1st of April 2022 to the 31st of March 2023 has an income of $75,000 or more, which in any instance arises because of supplemental wages or otherwise. And Mr. President, based on how this is drafted, I ask a fundamental question here to the administration. Are you targeting persons who are making $75,000 per year? Or are you targeting anyone who is making over $6,250 in any given month? And that person is now applicable to pay this levy. Because what you are essentially going to do is ring fence a lot of individuals who are self-employed, contractual workers. For instance, if you are a contractor and you get one job for the year, and you earn $25,000 from that, and you are paid in the month of, let's say, July. And that is the only work that you do until March of 2023. That person is working for less than $75,000 per month, but based on what this legislation states, they are included to pay this levy. I could be wrong, Mr. President. I am not a legal mind, but I would like an explanation and some clarity in that respect. What is even more interesting, Mr. President, about that clause is if you have an individual who's working for $4,500 a month, they're running their household, they have one spouse who is unemployed, 2 children in the house, having the responsibility of paying all the bills, and you tell yourself, well, I'm going to take on a side job or something to that effect, where it pushes you over that $6,250 a month, those persons are also included to pay this levy. So again, the question has to be asked, if the government is trying to receive monies from persons earning over a certain amount, the question has to be asked, Mr. President, why is it that the government has gone to painstaking length to include, particularly in this part of Clause 6, Part B, persons who earn in any given month has an income of $6,250 or more? Because what you're essentially going to do, a lot of people just will not pay this levy. And what will happen is people will avoid paying the levy rather than, if you had just said, persons who $75,000 per year, where there's clarity in where the burden and who is supposed to be paying the levy goes. Because the man that earns $55,000 in a year, because he's done some side work and his base income is $2,500 a month, why should he pay this levy? Why should he pay this levy? He is actively going out there working, trying to make ends meet. He's still not reaching that threshold of $75,000 a year. He's making just less than that. But you're saying in any given month, if his income goes above and beyond this $6,250, he's now included to pay this levy. Mr. President, I stand corrected. As I said, I'm not a legal luminary. I'm not a lawyer. I'm asking a question. If that is the intent of what is outlined in Clause 6, Part B. And Mr. President, I'd go even further, because if government has done, as is stated, a strategic analysis, that in and of itself is unfair and unnecessary. And I'll tell you why. By including those individuals, how much of a proportion of the revenues that you are seeking to get from this levy do those persons make up? Is the larger proportion of the revenues, Mr. President, from this pandemic levy, is it going to come from companies who are making the $5 million? Or is it coming from individuals making between, let's say, $6,250 and, let's say, $9,000? Which is the greater proportion? If the greater proportion, let's say, over and above 70% of the $100 million that Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight, the honorable member, stated, if a larger proportion of that money is coming from companies, then why is the government trying to bring people into this net unnecessarily? Because it does come across as punitive. It does come across as if, by any means necessary, the government is trying to take monies out of your income. And that's just the reality. Mr. President, what is also interesting is when you look through the estimates of revenue and expenditure for this year, I noted it when I was going through, when we went through the estimates debates. This levy is supposed to bring in revenues of $100 million. But based on the estimates of revenue and expenditure, there's an increase of $217 million from income and profits from last year in comparison to this year. And I asked the question, given the environment that we are in, if the levy is supposed to bring in $100 million, the previous year you only brought in about $200 odd million. Where is the other $100 million going to come from? Based on the government's estimates for revenue. Mr. President, and let us also be very, very clear. As much as we want to say to persons, hold strain, pay their share, be your brother's keeper, and people will say $62.50 on $6,000, $6,250. In comparison, is not a lot. But that's that person's gross salary. That is gross. That individual does not get that money in their hand. That person still has to pay 12.5% personal tax, PAYE. That person still has to pay 11% in NIS. The person may have medical insurance that comes directly out of their salary, the mortgage payment, the car payment. There are persons, Mr. President, the pension plan, Mr. President. There are persons in this country that work for $7,000, $8,000, Mr. President. And some of them, when they get the money in their hand, get less money than people who work for minimum wage. And there are people who would not believe it because they're living by a standard by which you would say, oh, they drive a vehicle, they live in a nice area. But their disposable income is so low that when that $62.50 comes up now, they might tell the gardener, well, you know, you can't come this week, or we're gonna mow the lawn ourselves. We're gonna mow the lawn ourselves. They're gonna tell the housekeeper, we have to let you go because there's just not enough money to go around anymore. And that is the reality. That is the economic reality of households right now. So that is why I'm asking, where is the intent in terms of the burden of this levy supposed to be, particularly as it relates to individuals and self-employed persons? Mr. President, I want for the general public who are listening to me to also note that this has to be paid on things like gratuities, because those have not been excluded. If you have worked in a business, and for whatever reason, you are now leaving that place, and your employer gives you gratuity between this intended time period, is the pandemic levy going to be placed on the gratuity of individuals? It is clearly going to be paid on things like back pay. If you reach over the $6,250, it is going to be placed on things like overtime. Mr. President, I even ask and go as far to place the question out there, would it be on personal injury payments? It is all in the design, Mr. President, the design of the policy. Sir, we have persons in this country who earn hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if there's any analysis that can tell the government who are the top 5, the top 1% earners in this country, I am asking for some reflection on where this pandemic contribution levy is being placed. Because people are struggling. Yes, at all levels. But if in 2015, Mr. President, the top 1% had 10 times the income of the average household, Mr. President, I would really like to know where that disparity lies now, after gone through COVID. Because globally, we know that this has been the largest transfer of wealth in history. Because the ones hardest hit was the working class and the middle class, Mr. President. And I ask the government, if you're going to target the top earners in the business community, target the top earners in terms of individuals and self-employed persons. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drake. Senator Dr. Bradford.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, fellow senators. Good afternoon. Mr. President, I had no intention of speaking on this bill, but in sober reflection, I thought I should say a few words. Mr. President, I think it is clear to all of us that we are not in normal times. I listened to Dr. Monroe Knight, and she clearly outlined the challenges which we have faced and which we are facing. A pandemic, the worst that we have had in almost 100 years. A war that we could not have contemplated. Economic global disruption of the logistics and delivery of goods and services. In these times, which are not normal, it is not unreal that we may have to take actions that are not normal, because we're not living in normal times. In recognizing the necessity of ensuring the continued progress of our nation, the continued stability of our nation, one recognizes the need for government to take appropriate action to keep the ship of state afloat and to address the issues that are critical for maintaining our progress and our stability. My concern for the bill does not relate to its intention. My concern for the bill relates to the breakdown of what the funds here collected are going to be used for. How much of the funds that will be collected will be used for social services? How much of the funds will be spent on education? How much of the funds will be used for the creation of employment opportunities? And how much of the funds will be used to maintain the social stability of the nation? I believe in circumstances like these, Mr. President, we should have this kind of information which would allow us to be even more objective in our analysis of these proposals. And we should be informed in clear language as to what the funds are going to be used for. I believe that while it is true that we are in unusual times, we need to be clear going forward on what costs, what elements, where are these funds going to be used in seeking to promote the continued stability and prosperity of our nation. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Brathwaite. Senator, Mr. Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I listened with pleasure as Senator Monroe Knight outlined for all to hear in great detail the wonderful work that the government has done during this pandemic to keep the country afloat and to save lives. Mr. President, I used to think of a contribution as a gift or donation or some benefaction, Mr. President. I never thought of it as an imposition, but I'm learning. But Mr. President, I think that it is necessary, and I do support the bill, but I do feel that we all have benefited, Mr. President. Probably more should pay. I am not certain, Mr. President, that the idea that, and I will never say that healthcare is free, and that is a notion that I've heard bandied about, with no disrespect, Mr. President, in both houses of Parliament. Healthcare in this country is not free. We pay a 3% health levy, possibly now 4%. But, Mr. President, it is not free. And it is wrong to get up in this House, Mr. President, and say that it is free. And it gives the wrong idea. Somebody has to pay. It may be free at the point of delivery, but we pay for it, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, we would not, as a country, be where we are were it not for the large sums of money that government has spent and borrowed during this pandemic. And this pandemic initially started as a healthcare crisis, and it morphed very, very quickly into an economic crisis. And we have so far weathered it. Now, I have never had the opportunity to stand in this chamber and do this, and I wish to thank, Mr. President, all those nurses who came from Cuba, without whose help, Mr. President, we would not, Mr. President, have done as well as we did. Not in a million years. And while I wish to thank all those nurses who came from Cuba, I should also thank our local nurses who have remained, Mr. President, and continue for care for all. Now, Senator Drake, Mr. President, went through with some detail and spoke about the $1 billion that we've spent and how much money is expected to be raised from this levy. And most of us believe that the language of rebuilding and building back better automatically applies to the funds raised from this levy. And there's a lot of building back that has to be done, Mr. President, because this country formally in writing, altered the health care sector, Mr. President. It formally altered the delivery of care to every person in this country in writing by slowing it down. We, in writing, denied people unfettered access, especially at the QH and in the polyclinics. We slowed it down. But there has been no formal effort, Mr. President, to speed it back up. And if you slow it down, Mr. President, in a stage where for 2 years, believe you me, it will continue in a slowed down way for the next 40. You have to formally sit down with a plan and speed it back up. All the people out there who are suffering, who are waiting for it to speed back up, unless we fix that next year this time and the year after and possibly longer, they will still be waiting. Mr. President, sometime before the COVID pandemic was declared, in this chamber, legislation was passed that altered the corporate tax rate. And I recall, sir, and I'm not good in figures, as you remember, somewhere in the region of $272 million in government revenue being wiped off the books, as it were, because of the change in the corporate tax rate. And along with the lost revenue from the COVID pandemic, I've asked myself what contribution that makes and how much of a dent will this levy have on that loss. But I'm afraid, Mr. President, of what it will do to investment, and particularly large investment in healthcare. Mr. President, the average doctor cannot buy a $5 million machine. He doesn't earn $5 million a year, but corporations do. And when they are asked to pay taxes on retroactive earnings, it may change their minds about investment, and investment in healthcare that is definitely needed. Because there are things that we do in medicine, Mr. President, that are outdated, but to bring them into the 21st century requires large investment. And I'm concerned that the retroactive aspect of this legislation for companies might delay or stop that investment. Mr. President, I want to spend a few seconds to speak about building back better. I, in fact, like it as a mantra that we'll build it back better. But all of us, Mr. President, every one of us has to put in the effort. Mr. President, I was saddened recently when I read that there was a statement where someone commented on the state of our tertiary care institution and suggested that their facilities were better. And I think it's deplorable, Mr. President, where people in a position who are paid to be in a position of leadership in our institutions will stand and in public, whether they are right or wrong, and pull them down. And I really think they should resign, because if it is not good enough for you, you should leave it. So I call, Mr. President, on those who make such statements to do so, to leave them and let people who will lead them and make them better and build them back better come into place. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Mr. Miller. Senator Dr. Moronic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I believe that I'm sensing that there is an overarching understanding of the importance of this levy, of the context for the imposition of this levy. I want, Mr. President, to address the issue of the concern around the retroactive nature of the levy by simply to say that this is this issue of whether it is good and bad is contested. I want to point out that there was a report in 2021 by the UK Commons, the House of Commons, in which they are considering the same issue, and which there are proponents as well who say that in the current context, we should have retroactive levies. That's a report that the House of Commons is considering. So that there is debate there, so that as we would find in literature those who say that this is a bad thing, there are those who in the context of this particular circumstance, having examined it, are also saying that this is an applicable treatment to be applied. So it's a contestation, yeah? And therefore, in the context of policy, you make decisions about what then is right for you within that particular context, even in the midst of something that is contested. I also want to speak to the issue of the tax base that this levy will be applied to, and questions around why aren't we just going after that small 1%, tax them heavily in order to be able to raise the necessary income. Mr. President, I want to suggest that tax policy would indicate that we try to keep the base as wide as possible and the tax rate, therefore, as low as possible. And this is why we have applied the 1% across a wide tax bracket, so that we do appreciate, as has been indicated, that it does bring in to that net, again, those middle-class persons. But we are also saying, as I said before, that we are asking for people not to see the imposition of the levy only by itself, but to see the range of other things that the government is doing that will help to mitigate and cushion that impact. So that while we recognize that, yes, we will have a base in which people will be impacted and in which the middle class will be impacted as well, Mr. President, we're also saying that the government then is intending as well through its social programs, through its investment policies, in order then to be able to mitigate that impact. We're also reminding as well, Mr. President, that we're talking here about a one-off levy for a specific period of time. And I want, in the context of the question in relation specifically to Part 2, Section B, to note that we are speaking about declared income, so that the person who goes on and does his little side hustle and, makes that money for that period of time, the levy will be applied so once they declare it on their tax. And so that we are saying to Barbadians, and I think this is why in the other place that there was a call for self-employed persons particularly not to play with the numbers, but to be honest, to be able to reflect their income so that we can have the collection of the levy as supposed to. But what 6B is saying is that we will apply the levy once it is declared, Mr. President. Mr. President, the question that was asked in relation to what will the levy be used for, I think on this floor, in this chamber, we have heard again that even in the context of the COVID pandemic, that we are in a particularly challenging context. Again, the war with Ukraine, the rising fuel prices, rising commodity prices that are impacting Barbadians, that are impacting countries. And therefore, in the context of that, The pandemic levy, as we said before, is intended, on the one hand, to shore up our social services. And again, Mr. President, I want to reiterate that I hope that people are understanding that when we talk about the pandemic contribution levy as one instrument, that we then have to partner what government is doing in other areas, so that the social services and the strengthening of the social services, the building back better of the social service, will then allow us to be able to cater and to mitigate impact, Mr. President. So that we have, and particularly, Mr. President, for those that would find themselves in circumstances where they are not able to cope, then we will be able to have a cushion through the pandemic levy. Additionally, the pandemic levy will also be used to help us to be able to finance some of the costs that would have been incurred in the context of the pandemic. Mr. President, government is making, and again, we talked about the estimates, tremendous contributions to education in order to be able to ensure that our educational system has the level of resilience that is necessary and will make it fit for purpose going forward. I sat just yesterday, I believed, or day before, at a meeting with officials from the Ministry of Health, where all of the key heads were concerned about how do we reform the health sector? How do we reform the Queen Elizabeth Hospital? And what were going to be the critical pillars that were going to be necessary in order for us to be able to do so? And to do so in the context of constrained resources, but with the understanding that we have to be able to deliver the best quality service to Barbadians. And one of the big debates that was there in the context of that discussion is that the QEH has at its core, as its core, Mr. President, the responsibility in order to be able to deliver. So the question that we kept coming back to, again, is how are we going to strengthen our efficiency and delivery? Mr. President, as I close, I want to say, as I said before, that the pandemic contribution levy, as it is applied, it is intended to help the government to be able to finance the cost of the pandemic. It is intended to help us address some of the structural weaknesses that we have, particularly in our social services sector, in order to build that resilience. That the government, however, is not dependent just on that, but that it is engaged in a multi-pronged strategy in order to be able to shore up our economy and our society. And therefore, Mr. President, I want to suggest that if we can all agree that there is a cause to be had in the context of the cost of the pandemic, that therefore, that we can look to the pandemic contribution levy as a fiscally responsible instrument, Mr. President, that will allow us to be able to respond. Mr. President, I therefore do now beg that this bill be read a second time, sorry.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Oh, there, I'm following my habits. The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. Senator Dr. Knight.
Mr. President, I do now beg that Your Honor leaves the chair and the Senate dissolves into committee.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honorable Senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The thing say ayes have it.
This House is now in committee.
Madam Deputy President, do we have your permission to take the bill in parts?
Permission granted.
Part 1, clauses 1 through 5.
I do not beg that clauses 1 through 5 stand par.
The question is that clauses 1 through 5 do now stand par. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
I do not beg that part 2, clauses 6 to 10 stand par.
The question is that clauses 6 through 10 do now stand par. Those in favor.
Madam Chair, just for clarity in committee, given the questions that I raised, is it the intention of the bill to include, based on clause 6, part B, to include individuals who earn less than $75,000 per year based on the wording of clause 6, part B, Madam Chair?
Sorry, Madam Chair. It is that this clause would be applicable to the income tax. It's drawn from the Income Tax Act, and it will be based on the declared income.
Madam Chair, sorry. And if the declared income is less than $75,000, is this levy still applicable?
Senator Monroe Knight.
Madam Chair, the clause applies to self-employed persons who, within the particular period specified, has an income of $75,000 or more. So if in the context of the declared income for the period specified, it falls less than that, then the levy will not apply.
Madam Chair, thank you. But based on what Senator Monroe Knight has just said, then what is outlined in Clause 6B is a bit untidy, because the interpretation based on the wording specifically outlines any individual who does not ordinarily have an income of $6,250 or more per month, or $75,000 or more per annum, but in any given month has an income of $6,250 or more, or making them two separate categories, or for the period in question, has an income of $75,000. So it's left up to the interpretation. I'm asking for clarity. I don't have it, Madam Chair. So I don't know.
Madam Chair.
Senator Monroe Knight.
Thank you. Madam Chair, Part 6B, as was indicated, indicates that an individual employed in Barbados who does not ordinarily have an income of $6,250 or more for the month or $75,000. In the first part of the question, I responded to indicate that this will be based in terms of the application of the levy, one, on the basis of declared income. So if you are in the category of the person who does not ordinarily have that, but in one particular month you are able then to have that particular income, in order for the levy to apply, you must declare it. First thing, right? You must declare it. If you do not declare that you have that income, the levy then cannot apply. And this clause B, as we indicated before, is relative to the Income Tax Act. And in that context, like I said, you must declare it. So I am unsure, I am unsure, Chair, in terms of how to further respond to the question, because in my mind, the answer is stated here and indicated in what I have proposed, Madam Chair.
Question is that clauses 4, 5, and 6 do not stand part. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And those against? No. Please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 11 to 14.
Senator Knight.
Madam Chair, I do now beg that Part 3, clauses 11 to 14, do not stand par.
Question is that Part 3, clauses 11 through 14 do now stand part. Will those in favor please say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. No. I believe the ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 15 to 17.
I do now beg that Part 4, clauses 15 to 17 stand par.
Question is that Part 4, clauses 15 through 17 do now stand part. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And those against, please say no. No. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 18 to 21.
I do now beg that Part 5, clauses 18 to 21 stand par.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 18 to 21 do now stand part. Will all those in favor please say aye? And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
I do now beg that Part 6, clauses 22 to 26 stand par.
The question is that Part 6, clauses 22 to 26 do now stand part. Those in favor, please say aye. And those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
I do not beg that Part 7, clauses 27 to 33 stand par.
The question is that Part 7, clauses 27 to 33 do now stand part. Will those in favor please say aye? And will those against please say no? The ayes have it.
I beg to move that the schedule be scheduled to the bill.
Question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. Those in favor, please say aye. And those against, please say no.
Madam Chair, I do now beg that you report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Those in favor, please say aye. And those against, please say no.
The chairman has just reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Mr. President, I do now beg that this bill be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
I do not beg that this bill be passed and be cited as the Pandemic Contribution Levy Act 2022.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Pandemic Contribution Levy Act 2022. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is
Mr. President.
Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask for a division. A divide?
Yes.
Is that possible?
I'll take guidance from the clerks. Usually what you do is according to the standing orders, we take a voice vote. If you need to request a division before the vote is taken, I'll be guided by the clerk. Mr. Jones. A vote has been called for. The clerks will take the vote.
You don't have a bell. There's no bell here. Where's the bell? Mr. President, would you put the question again? Question that the bill do not pass?
The question is that this bill be no passed.
Senator Ms. Cummins,
Aye.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight,
Aye.
Senator King,
Aye.
Senator Ms. Paris,
Aye.
Senator Haywood,
Aye.
Senator Mrs. Roberts Odle,
Aye.
Senator Boyce,
Aye.
Senator Nichols,
Aye.
Senator Mr. Maynard, Senator Boyce,
Aye.
Senator Ms. Strakes,
Abstain.
Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers,
Aye.
Senator Dr. Hines,
No.
Senator Dr. Honorable Buffett.
Aye.
You didn't have one. Mr. Jones, Her Honor, Deputy Speaker, Deputy President.
I beg your pardon, Madam Deputy President. Senator Thompson.
Rest assured, Deputy Clerk, that I always vote, and in this case, I vote aye.
Mr. President, the result of the vote is 13 honorable senators voted aye, 1 honorable senator abstained, and 1 honorable senator voted no.
This bill is therefore so passed and cited. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of this sitting of the Senate to reconvene at 10 minutes before 3 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:50 p.m. today. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This sitting is therefore so suspended.